Kate got to say good morning, and we've passed that boundary, so I get to say good afternoon. So good afternoon, and let's pray that the Lord will continue to bless us as we move on to His Word. So we've, let me just find my start point in my reading. So those of us who've been following the church's reading plan through the course of the year, not that we've only had much of it so far, we've only had two months of it nearly, but the last few weeks we've been reading from the book of Exodus, and I wanted to pick up the story in the book of Exodus, from the closing of the book of Exodus in the reading this morning. So the end of Exodus talks about the building of the tabernacle. God lays out great plans for what the tabernacle, like, and they build the tabernacle. And there's 13 chapters of it, okay? So you might say, well, the good news this morning is I'm not going to read all 13 chapters, okay? So this is the very end of the building of the tabernacle, where they take all the parts that they've built to assemble the tabernacle, because it's a movable meeting place, and they build the tabernacle. And we're picking up the story from verse 17. So the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the second year. When Moses set up the tabernacle, he put the bases in place, erected the frames, inserted the crossbars, and set up the posts. Then he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering over the tent, as the Lord commanded him. He took the testimony and placed it in the ark, attached the poles to the ark, and put the atonement cover on it. Then he brought the ark into the tabernacle, and he hung the shielding curtains and shielded the ark of the testimony, as the Lord commanded him. Moses placed the table in the tent of meeting on the north side of the tabernacle, outside the curtain, and set out the bread on it before the Lord, as the Lord commanded him. He placed the lampstand in the tent of meeting opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and set up the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord commanded him. Moses placed the gold altar in the tent of meeting in front of the curtain, and burnt fragrant incense on it, as the Lord commanded him. Then he put up the curtain at the entrance to the tabernacle. He set the altar of burnt offering near the entrance to the tabernacle, and the tent of meeting, and offered on it burnt offerings and grain offerings, as the Lord commanded him. He placed the basin before the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it for washing. And Moses and Aaron and his sons used it to wash their hands and feet. They washed whenever they entered the tent of meeting or approached the altar, as the Lord commanded Moses. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and the altar, and put the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard, and so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting, because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels. This is the word of the Lord. So, this morning we continue our series on the first of the 6 pursuits that we laid out as a church some time ago. We pursue an encounter with God. And as I've said, if you follow our daily readings, we are concluding, I think on Monday technically we conclude our readings from the book of Exodus. Exodus is a book rich in encounters with God, as God leads his people out of Egypt, where they have been since the time of Joseph, and they start their journey to the land which God has promised them, led by Moses. So it seems that this is a great choice of a book to be reading at the moment, because it's full of encounters with God. And it seems to me, as we read the book of Exodus, in a way that it describes 3 journeys. First of all, the book of Exodus captures the physical journey as the people travel from slavery in Egypt, and the bondage is broken, and their service to Pharaoh, and they start that journey, and they move out, So you've got the first of the journeys that are captured is the physical journey. As they start to move out, there's a lot more of the journey as we carry on reading other books later on, but they've started that great journey as God redeems his people from the land of Egypt. Secondly, it seems to me that the book of Exodus describes a spiritual journey in how the people encounter God. There are many encounters with God through the book, whether that's the encounters that Moses has with God or the encounters that his people have with God. But I'm going to suggest that those are not just a series of encounters in chronological order, in time order, but they represent a progression in how God interacts with his people, leading to this great climax at the end of Exodus that I've read, where God inhabits the tabernacle at the heart of his people. And as well as a physical and a spiritual journey, I'm going to say you can look at the book of Exodus and you can see that as an illustration of the Christian life. You know, we were once slaves to sins before we knew Christ, as the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt. God calls us and we respond, leaving that old life behind. Perhaps when you think back to the time that you first chose to follow Christ, you remember that you experienced the pull of the old life at times, trying to pull you back to what you had known before, just as the Israelites experience Pharaoh trying to bring them back to Egypt as they are pursued by his armies. But then the Israelites pass through the waters of the Red Sea, and so we, as believers, pass through the waters of baptism. And as God ended Pharaoh's hold on the Israelites, God breaks the hold that the old life had upon us. The waters parted, the people went through, and the waters closed behind. They could no longer go back easily to the old life, even if they wanted to, because the waters had closed behind them, and they could no longer go back the way they came. And similarly, when we respond to Christ, the chains of the old life are broken. It may take time before we fully enter into the promised land, but in the meantime we have time to grow and mature as Christians as we are prepared for eternity with Christ. Last week, Julie, as is routine, asked me what the topic of our message this morning would be to help in the choosing of the songs. And I chose lessons from Exodus. Because as we consider Exodus as a spiritual journey, one can see how God's people grow in their knowledge of the Almighty as they encounter him through that journey. But where are they starting from spiritually as we start the story of Exodus? Well, as the book of Exodus, strangely enough, starts with the end of Genesis. In Genesis, we see how a series of patriarchs, great men of faith, encountered God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each encountered God in different ways and received promises from him. However, that series of encounters seems to have stopped with Jacob. Jacob dies in the book of Genesis, and indeed Joseph dies at the end of the book of Genesis. And so the people are in the promised land. And that chain of patriarchs who had the experience of an encounter with God, that chain seems to be broken because Jacob is the last. You might think that perhaps Joseph or one of his brothers would have that same encounter with God. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Joseph recognizes that being sent ahead to Egypt is the work of the Lord, but he doesn't seem to have an encounter with God in the way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has. And generations pass in Egypt where nobody seems to have an encounter with God in the way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. Secondly, I wonder to what degree the Hebrews continue to worship God in Egypt. Through Genesis, that contact with God is through the patriarchs, and the promise is made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the story is largely about them and their immediate families, and the promises made to them that God will create a great nation from their offspring, that he will be their God and that they will be his people. And as the number of Hebrews grows in Egypt to some 600,000 men, it tells us, traveled along with women and children, I wonder, do they start to worship God for themselves at that point? Or are we still waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled, that he will be their God and they will be his people? We know that the Hebrew midwives feared God, but Exodus is pretty silent about anybody else in Egypt, the Israelites worshipping God. But we know that God hears the Hebrews cry out of their ill treatment. Although it doesn't seem to be to God Almighty that they cry, but they do cry out, and God hears, for he is a faithful God. And then as the story continues, where God appears to Moses, and we had the story of the burning bush and that fantastic encounter with God the other week. Moses and Aaron return to Egypt, and they meet the elders of the Israel and explain that God is going to call them out of Egypt. And it's interesting to me that they don't say that your God has responded to your prayer and sent me to bring you out of Egypt. Their appeal is to the gods of their ancestors, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think the implication of that, if I was to say to you that your grandfather's God says this, that would kind of imply that he's not also your God, that somehow something has changed in the meantime. And I think that is an implication. We get used to the phrase, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yet maybe that within that phrase there is an implication that things have changed and that God is not at that time the God of the people he was speaking to. But nevertheless, Moses and Aaron lay out the plan, and we hear that the elders of Israel respond in worship. And I think that's the first mention of worship that we come across as we read through Exodus in terms of the people, the Hebrews, worshipping God. And then when, having received the approval of the leaders of the people of Israel, Moses and Aaron make their appeal to Pharaoh to let the people go. And of course then Pharaoh responds and he says, "Who is this Lord?" And I don't know the Lord. And of course you can take that as saying that he doesn't, he has his own gods, so they're not his God. But maybe he's generally never heard that the Israelites have a God. Maybe if things have declined to that point, that they have abandoned God, perhaps. But God has not abandoned them. He has heard their cry. And so the story progresses. But essentially, as I read Exodus, I came to the conclusion that there was very much a low point, both in terms of the people's slavery in Egypt, but very much a low point in terms of their experience of the living God, with the line of the patriarchs broken. And yet God has not forgotten his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he would make a great nation of their descendants, and that he will be their God and they will be his people. It just seems that it hasn't happened yet. And so the Hebrews start their spiritual journey with God as they come from this very low point. And I'm not giving too much away by saying that the book of Exodus will end on a very high point. Indeed, we read it earlier. But in the meantime, there are some bumps along the way as the Hebrews travel out of Egypt, and the bondage to Egypt is broken. And I want to consider two bumps along the road as the Hebrews undertake their spiritual journey. You'll recall that the Lord showed the people which way to travel by leading them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. It's clear then that the route that they take is determined by the Lord himself. However, when Pharaoh's armies come chasing after the Hebrews, it seems to be largely Moses who gets the blame, despite the fact that they're there following the pillars of fire and cloud. Moses gets the blame for the predicament that the people find themselves out in the deserts. It seems that in moments like this, the continuing presence of God in the pillars and in the cloud and the flame is forgotten as the people turn on their faithful leader. But God's will prevails, and the people pass through the Red Sea that runs down the eastern side of Egypt and out of Pharaoh's hands as the seas close and they can no longer go back the way they came, and nor can Pharaoh come and get them. God has demonstrated his power and faithfulness, and Moses is vindicated as the faithful leader despite his unpopularity briefly with the people. Second, later on, another bump in the road, you'll recall that Moses goes to meet with the Lord, and he goes for 40 days. However, the people become concerned by Moses' long absence, and so they invite Aaron to make them gods. And Aaron makes them. He casts them a golden calf from their jewelry. Aaron builds an altar before it, and Aaron announces a great festival before this creation of the people. How impatient they are. How ironic that as Aaron is knocking up this false idol, the Almighty is revealing to Moses on the mountain the plans for the tabernacle. It seems that Aaron is very much offering a substandard, to say the least, alternative to the plans that the Lord is laying out for Moses on the mountain. Aaron, with the impatience of the people, is creating this idol. How easily the people rejected God's best, a continuing encounter with the living God, for a mere idol. How disappointing that Aaron should do this, given his position with Moses. However, let's remember that it's Moses who has the encounters with God. It's Moses whose life is being shaped by the encounters with God that he has. Aaron is just his eloquent mouthpiece, if you like, where Moses feeds him the words, and Aaron puts it in an eloquent manner, because he's the persuasive one. He has the gift of the gab, if you want to put it that way. It would seem that eloquence alone is no substitute for the reality of an encounter with the living God. And it is Moses who knows the reality of the encounter of the living God. And it's Aaron who's just being a populist and trying to keep the people happy without any personal encounter with the living God. What a contrast in leadership styles between the two leaders, Moses and Aaron. Moses, who encounters God, but sometimes gets harsh criticism from the people. And Aaron, the populist, who just gave the people what they wanted in terms of the false idol. And I wonder, as we are looking to a new season in leadership, what sort of leadership would we like in our community? Are we looking for somebody who will, acquiesce with our complaints and give us what we want, or are we looking for somebody who has his ear on the Word of God, somebody who has a daily encounters with God? And what he tells us may not be popular at times, but he's got his finger on what God requires of us. Do we want a Moses or an Aaron? And are we, what are the consequences of that? And so we move on. We've had the bumps in that we started at a low base with the people in Egypt, in slavery, not heard from God from a long time. And we've had the bumps in the road as the journey progresses. And then we arrive at the climax of the book of Exodus, as we arrive with the tabernacle. Or more specifically, it's not the tabernacle which is the climax, it's the glory of God inhabiting the tabernacle. As Moses spent 40 days on the mountain, God gives him a detailed description of what the tabernacle should be like. And it takes 7 chapters. So we tend to think of Moses on the mountain coming down with the 10 Commandments. But that's small compared to the 7 chapters of instructions that God gives for what the what the tabernacle should be like. When they then, shortly afterwards, build the tabernacle, there are another 6 chapters on making the tabernacle, detail by detail, confirming that God's requirements are precisely mirrored in the building of the tabernacle as God instructed, even down to which craftsman should be doing the work. You know, you've got Aaron, it says, knocked up this idol with a tool, and I'm not sure what kind of, as an engineer, I'm not sure what sort of single tool you'd make an idol out of, but maybe it's not a very good idol, and maybe Aaron's not a very good craftsman either, but in God's instructions, he lays down precisely who amongst the community he have the skills to build a tabernacle and names them who should take the lead on the construction of the tabernacle. And they build the tabernacle, and it takes 13 chapters if you combine the chapters of what it should be like and the chapters that describe what it is like. That's almost a third of the book of Exodus. So the tabernacle is obviously massively important to get all of this attention. God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to not only make their descendants a great nation, but that he would be their God and they would be his people. The great climax of Exodus is now that the glory of the Lord isn't just before them, showing them which way they should go, but when they aren't moving, the glory of the Lord occupies the tabernacle at the heart of this people, a continuing encounter which demonstrates that now truly he is their God and they are his people. No longer is God's presence to be sought on the mountain by Moses alone or the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before him, but rather God's living presence is among his people, so each can encounter him. So I wonder if you've ever thought about why the tabernacle is so complicated, that it takes all of these chapters and chapters of description to provide. And there are books that will take you into umpteen detail of every feature of the tabernacle and why it is the way it is. But there is a big picture answer into why the tabernacle is the way it is, and that's laid out in the book of Hebrews. So because the book of Hebrews tells us that the tabernacle that Moses built is a copy of a tabernacle that's somewhere else, a tabernacle that is in heaven. And so as Moses receives instruction from God in what the tabernacle should be like, and then the tabernacle is built to that, they are copying the tabernacle that exists in heaven. And Hebrews 8 tells us that Moses' tabernacle is a copy of another tabernacle, where Christ serves as the high priest, redeeming souls through his own blood, once and for all, through his one sacrifice. And I'm going to flip to Hebrews. I have a piece of ribbon in here. There we go. So, this is from Hebrews 8. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be a covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Now that's in Hebrews, and it's written in the future tense because they're quoting Jeremiah. And Hebrews goes on to say that this is fulfilled. This is prophecy fulfilled, that God has created a new covenant through Christ, that he has, where Christ offers sacrifice in the new tabernacle in heaven. And so we can enter into the fullness of knowing God, having an encounter with God through what Christ has done for us. And I will, one more quote when I can find it. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, that he who promised is faithful. And we have a faithful God, a God who is faithful to his people when they were in Israel. Though they had virtually forgotten him, he didn't forget them. He heard their cry. He brought them out of slavery in Egypt, and ultimately will take them into the promised land. And so he has also heard our cry through the new covenant, and he longs to be in relation with us, for us to encounter him daily, as they encountered him daily. His presence among them, either present in the tabernacle, in the midst of the community, or going ahead of them, showing them the way that they should go as they sought to serve him and to move as a community in the direction that God was calling.